So Melanie is from, she is in the ELSI group at the BBMRI-ERIC project. So thanks, Melanie.
Thank you, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you can see my presentation in full screen and can hear me well. So I was invited to say something about the ELSI considerations in merging data or data harmonization. And so you heard already that ELSI was involved in a couple of slides, and so it is needed somehow, but why? And let me just briefly remind you what ELSI means. So the ethical, legal, societal, or social issues or implications. And we already heard a lot about data and how data is used, and existing data sets are used, and also categories like sex or ethnic background and so on and so forth. So my presentation will be more about what's behind that. So this is data coming from persons, from people, and which could also have implications for individuals or groups. So ELSI itself, not a discipline in itself, it combines many disciplines. So it's, for instance, about the legal requirements related to privacy and data protection, so a legal side, but also the kind of ethical, societal, social part, which I will focus on since my background is in social science. And the S in ELSI, so to say, deals with the ethical challenges about consent, for example, also participants' autonomy, all implications coming from new technologies, for instance, new genome sequencing technologies, secondary use of data, so the data sets, for instance, we heard about that already existed and are now used for different studies, and options for returning results to research participants. Coming with that is also the questions of how to protect vulnerable groups. So, for instance, in cohorts involving children, older people, economically and socially disadvantaged groups with a certain background, and so on. And also questions or issues regarding public engagement, so public support and approval by all these kinds of research, and also how to recognize patients or publics as active participants, and also involve them into the governance of research. And with that, I already gave you a little overview about the topics I will briefly cover, or give you just an overview about it. So first, consent and governance. So every research with data or using samples from human needs to be based on informed consent. So broad consent, which means this is a form of consent that allows several uses for a specific field. So for instance, medical research or cancer research. And this model or form of consent has become the preferred model in biobanking, for data repositories and so on, to allow the use and sharing of existing data sets. There are a couple of requirements coming with it from ethics, so consent must be given freely. This is, of course, also a challenge in the context of involving vulnerable groups or situations of institutional or hierarchical dependency. So, for instance, vulnerable groups, if your cohort involves children, so what kind of implications are coming with that? Then consent should also be informed, but how much informed is informed? So especially with coming with new technologies or possibilities of data merging and harmonization. So which means participants in research are asked to consent to really broad spectrums, also to unknown futures. We do not know yet what data is collected, what will be possible in 10 years, for instance, what kind of actors there will be involved, what kind of countries there will be involved. And consent is also one part of governance of research. And I put a quote here on the slide defining that a good governance framework should specify the scope of research, which is, of course, also a requirement for consent. which data may be used, including any restrictions based either on the original consent or on guidelines generated for the repository, and specify measures that will be used to mitigate or prevent unintended harms and misuses, including transparent decision-making and oversight processes. So in using data, it already comes a lot of responsibilities in also how to handle it. And for instance, if the use of data is in line with the reason why people donated this data. And what we are talking now about is secondary use, which defines all uses that are going beyond the original planned or study, or maybe also the consent that was given, and then the data was used for other kinds of purposes. So the questions that are coming with that is simply from the legal aspect, are you allowed to do that? Is the purpose of additional research in the scope of the original, mostly broad consent? And you also have to keep in mind, as I've mentioned, this is also research taking place in the future, somehow from the perspective of research participants, that are also what qualifies, for instance, health-related research may change over time, but the consent was given at the time point people were consenting to participate in the research. So this needs to be taken into considerations. It could also be necessary to reconsent, which means to ask people to consent again for the study. And this, of course, comes with some challenges. So how to keep participants engaged in this study, what time resources are needed for that. Do you lose data subjects or data, so to say, and what kind of privacy risks are coming with that if you keep contact details from your research participants. And what we see also within CINECA, or observe a little bit there, is the challenge that comes with it is the balancing between de-identification or anonymization of data, which is also seen as the way to manage these challenges. A little bit also in contrast with a kind of ethical re-identification. So if a research secondary use of this data then shows there might be some findings that might be relevant for the research participants, which might have an impact on patients' life, or would qualify them as a participants for other studies, would then consent be necessary? So that would be one question, and also how to re-identify them, participants. What is also a challenge are some different requirements or principles. So data minimization coming from data protection, and coming from the FAIR principles, the need for rich data sets to enable these kinds of research, and also how the data needs to look like, so the level of granularity that you need, and the level of granularity that could be harmful for vulnerable or ethnic groups in terms of re-identification, which is kind of not ethical, but more in going into could go into the direction of stigmatization or discrimination. So anonymization versus re-identification is also a broad spectrum, or there's a discourse going on, because anonymization is seen as a minimum requirement to protect subjects' privacy. Although with today's technologies and so on, and possibilities and other repositories, it is becomes more possible, even if it's not legally allowed to re-identify research participants through cross-referencing with other data sets or other kinds of data. And also dealing with genomic data, you need to be aware that people can be identified with these kinds of data by this cross-referencing. So there is a risk of matching anonymized data, which also were kind of mentioned as that in the consent form, with data from other data sets. and allowing or opening up a little bit the possibility of re-identification. We just recently submitted a paper on re-identification. I hope it will be published soon, but until that, I want to make you aware that we gave a workshop, which you can find on the BBMRI-ERIC YouTube channel about re-identification in the context of genomic data. So building data sets or big data sets comes also with going from individuals to groups. So that means that this is also kind of a challenge that is coming, because traditional research ethics has focused on the harms to the individual participants, but big data operates on or impacts groups. So where anonymized data subjects are grouped according to geographical, socioeconomic, ethnic, or other characteristics, the anonymization of individuals matters little if the outcomes itself could have effects or impacts on the group to which they belong. So there could be a problematic discrimination and stigmatization of these groups, and this is then a real risk for not only for the participants but for groups, even for anonymized data sets. So in that regard, also it needs to be thought about if anonymization is sufficient, given the risk of re-identification or the implications it might have for groups. So as mentioned, the risk of stigmatization and discrimination, also given, as I said, the risk profile has changed. We are living in a datafied world, so there are many data sets out there. Cross-referencing could be possible, and this could also have effects on people not directly participating also in these studies, or not having given consent to a specific study, as the outcomes may have kind of impacts on the group. On the other hand, potential discrimination can also come that in the research design, there might be an unequal representation of certain groups, which could result in a lack of diversity in genetic informations, and also biased findings. So this kind of discrimination can also appear in connection with the research process and design. So there is a way of how to include or how to make use of specific aspects or groups, not to just emphasize them, but also to include them when it's necessary to include them, or to make such, or if you need this kind of information. I just put a little bit on the slide, which you can, one of the cases that has been discussed within the ethics discourse, and you can easily follow up on that, the case of the Havasupai tribe in North America. So members of the tribe gave blood samples for research into type 2 diabetes. The consent sheets covered the reason or the research purpose on the causes of behavioral and medical disorders. And beyond these type 2 diabetes studies, these samples were also used in research related to ethnic migration, metabolic disorders, alcoholism, and schizophrenia. The latter is a stigmatizing condition within the tribe, and so it had an impact on the tribe. These findings had an impact on the tribe, and was also was a problem that also participants mentioned they were not aware what they were giving consent to, and this kind of studies that went beyond the original research. So again, here the definition of what informed consent means is particularly changed also within vulnerable groups. So another example is for data use and processing. We also critically looked into a study on same-sex sexual behavior that used data sets from UK Biobank and 23andMe. It was a genome-wide association studies. As mentioned here, into the genetic architecture of same-sex sexual behavior. And the consent that were used, or consent that were used for participants, for instance, UK Biobank mentioned health-related research purposes. So we can discuss also if same-sex sexual behavior falls into the scope of health-related research purposes, and what may be implications that may come with it. For instance, homosexuality is already long removed from kind of the disease classification system, but is it then again reinscribed into the scope of health-related research? And it also comes with some limitations in how the data were used for kind of a secondary use for the study. For instance, that some people were excluded from the sample, as mentioned here on the right-hand side. For instance, those who self-identified sex, gender, and kind of biological sex did not match. These were all made transparent. This is mentioned in the limitations, but we need to also think about what kind of implications are coming with such decision in the use or in the processing of the data. Yeah, if you want to read more about that, I can just briefly mention, this is the title of our paper where we kind of critically discuss this way how the data is used and also the social categories that are used for this specific research question. So we were talking about the researchers and research, but what do participants want? And there are many studies where the answer clearly said they want to have a choice in the ways data is used. So for instance, reconsent would be preferred if the circumstances under which the study research with the data or samples in the case of biobanks is performed changes. And most participants also want to have a say in how the data and samples are used to different degrees. So I mentioned a couple of studies here where you can see that in the recent Your DNA USA studies, it was connected also to trust in the data processing, and this became problematic also for participants when multiple actors are involved. So the levels of trust were not so high when it comes to all these involvements and when the data is traveling to many, many places. From my own research, I can give you the example that participants or citizens also base their decision in their understanding of the appropriate of research practice or research, especially in the context of genomic data. So we also need to think about how to communicate the purpose of the research, and is this in their scope, so to say, of the research participant, and also to think about the use of broad consent in low and middle income countries, and if additional safeguards are needed, and which modes to engage with the communities are needed. So freely given, which is really important for the question of consent, means also to give people real choice and control, and how to do that need to be taken into the consideration for, as I mentioned before, also for good governance structures or models for research. You heard about already the FAIR principles. So FAIR standing for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. I also want to highlight a little bit beside these more technical principles, kind of the other side or an additional side, which is then fairness. So all the kind of social relations or the social framework that comes with the use of such data. So collaborations with partners from low-income countries must ensure the equitable sharing of data and benefits. So especially the researchers involved in terms of sharing the credits, so authorship, publication, outputs, funding and training, sharing of the research outcomes, knowledge, technologies and other benefits, so benefit sharing, to use a broader term here. And there need to be also the development of common standards to build trust and to build this fair, transparent data sharing flow between all partners. And you also need to take into consideration the harms and benefits for data sharing with individuals, families, and communicate, and potential impact it may have on vulnerable people and data subjects coming from low resource countries, because as you are aware that there is a long history also of unethical use of African data and biological material, as well as potential repeated misuse and commercialization of African genetic material. So the question of a fair and equitable use of data is very important, and also the establishment of equal partnerships are vital for good governance structures. So the Age3 Africa guidelines for consent highlight here that a robust governance framework that should seek to promote global health and research equity and take into account 5 key elements: respect, authentic community engagement and trust building, the preservation of privacy and confidentiality, feedback of results, and capacity strengthening. And also to engage with public participants, communicate, especially also research participants, representative of vulnerable groups, and so on, is also very important. Okay, for time reasons, I was running through some of the aspects, so I want to briefly highlight where you can find more on several topics, for instance, on the BBMRI-ERIC ELSI knowledge base for topics such as incidental findings, how to manage personal data in a new project, also international data sharing, material transfer agreements, data transfer agreements, also to cover a little bit also the legal sides. And you can also find that in the webinars which we made or had for the CINECA project. So you can find on the CINECA YouTube channel also a webinar on the ethical, legal, societal issues, and also another webinar on a little bit more on some of the aspects I just mentioned on the ELSI considerations from fair to fair data sharing, so to say. Yeah, and with that, sorry for running through it, but I hope I made you aware of some things you need to take into the considerations while using existing data sets or secondary data. And you can find my email also here. If you have questions or want to get in touch, please feel free to send me a message. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Melanie. So some really important considerations. We always think of the data, but we don't think about the ELSI aspects. Are there any questions for Melanie? Lauren.
Sure. So one thing I think is interesting is kind of this idea that we're not going to seek consent for the reuse of anonymized data. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. So like in the European health data space and in other health data spaces, or in a lot of data sharing initiatives, you know, we don't seek consent for reuse of health data because the data are anonymized. And I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that and what you think.
Yeah, you're right. Of course, these initiatives building large data sets and data access is, of course, also important for good governance and for, of course, for kinds of medical research as we are talking about here. So this should be clearly enabled, but in a responsible and ethical way. So I don't know, especially it depends really on also on the initiatives, but for bringing all this data together, of course, from the legal side, it needs to be taken into the consideration. Is it allowed by the original consent sheet, or in which ways? And I cannot say so much about the legal side. So as a social scientist, I of course always go a little bit beyond that. So in what implications there could be, and what maybe will be opened up with in doing so. So as I mentioned, this is one example about data that is used for a study on sexual orientation in the scope of health research. So I think we need to, from the socio-ethical perspective, we need to think about, is this still in the intention from the data participants? So is it slightly a different question? The legal question is, I guess, more complex. Also, broad consent is not the only consent model. There are also tiered consent models and so on, giving. So I think that's more for the future, I would say, also in how to rethink consent models to include it. So also mechanism maybe for reconsent, or ways of having a not just a one-way directed information channel, but both ways, where you can say, okay, I can choose a little bit in what direction my data will be used, or if something changed in the way the biobank or these repositories are working, then I will be informed and I have to change to withdraw my consent or change my consent preferences. From the legal side, yeah, it's always a challenge then, I guess, to find the legal basis for it. And also, what you also mentioned, it's not maybe in the consent form, and of course there are always risks that we learn about in the future, but are there also risk mitigation in place, and what kind of safeguards are in place? Are there ethics committees, data access committees, and so on, that try to protect and make sure that it's within the scope? I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but it's a broad field, and I think we must look really into the specific application.
Great, thanks, Melanie. Any other questions? I don't see any hands. So thanks to the speakers for the first session. Again, please keep asking questions in the chat.